All right, welcome everybody to the Three Beards podcast. I don't know what I'm doing, so I just killed our intro. So, ta-da! Here, I'll make some sounds. So, with that amazing introduction, we would like to welcome Mark Eddy. He's coming to help us here with our guest of this show, Mr. David Collis, author of Interviewing Jesus the Man. How are you tonight, sir?
I am well, and thank you for having me on your show.
Our pleasure. Like I said, it was one of those, been trying to get you on here for a while, and it was the one you were just in the long drawn out process of trying to relocate.
I
was.
And then everything fell through. Right at the last minute.
So you're still at the same location then that you were before you?
I am.
Man, so it's, we were just looking forward to this thing because we've really, in the last few shows, we've really started kind of branching into kind of the Gnostic side of the Bible, and thing from Wallace Wagner Jr., Crossing the Crevasse, where we talked about a lot of these things where they're depictions of crafts, UFOs in the Bible, where just you have a lot of these works where it just clearly, like, the way the wording is, the way it sounds, it makes so much more sense when you actually think about it as not just something, mysterious. But where if it's more physical, it makes so much more sense. When I'm among you.
That's right. Well, there is a lot of paranormal activity in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, and Jesus sure was experiencing it.
But you think about it too. It's when everybody's looking at all this stuff, when they talk about it, for the longest time, like, Christianity has always been, you can't do, this is, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do these things. And then when you actually look at it, all these, what is a miracle by Jesus, if not something that is paranormal, not, just that it would be considered when you're saying, well, you can't practice witchcraft. I'm not sure what else you call turning, a normal glass of water into suddenly now you've got a glass of vino for everybody to drink. I mean, this seems like it seems what most people would call magic. So, I mean, you're doing these things. And as we're going through these, I'm like, these things make a lot of sense. And your book, interview, it was an amazing take on what everybody's read. If you're religious, you've read these passages. And one of the things I really wanted to get to, and we'll get to this part here, is about, I've always said, this man, we don't know anything from his adolescent preteen years to when he rides back into Jerusalem. What happened during these times? And your book is one of those that, in my way, is really attempting to fill in this missing time part in this gap.
That was the most important thing for me. And since I didn't have any place to start, I started with his sayings. And from his sayings, I went backwards. So I reverse engineered his life based off of the end of it. So we understand, we only know there's only a few passages in the Gospels that talk about Jesus's early life. So we have his birth, we have him going to his bar mitzvah. And then after that, he shows up at the footsteps of John the Baptist, at the Jordan River. And so we have this roughly an 18-year gap between the moment that we see him in the temple, really kind of surprising the priest there, and then the start of his ministry when he goes to John the Baptist. So, there's that big, huge gap that's always been a fascination to me. And finally, I decided that I wanted to, since I've been involved in Christianity and understanding Christianity and studying Christianity and looking at the historical documents and reading a lot of literature, I finally just decided that maybe I needed to apply kind of my intellect and bore into that period of his life. And the way I did that is that I started at the end and I worked backwards.
Wow. It was Mark, when he first pitched, the idea of bringing you on, one of the things we had talked about was the parable of the mustard seed.
Yes.
And it's one of those things, anybody that's from that area, you wouldn't have known what a mustard seed was because it wasn't from that area. So it would be I've always just, try to make up something. It's like when I come to you and I try to explain this to you, you're like, I don't know what that is. So how is this going to be, how am I going to relate to something I don't even know what it is? I mean, it's okay. It's a cool thing you're describing, but people where you come from, it would make more sense if he was actually in the area where it has grown. And that's that's one of the things I loved.
If you think about, you have to kind of understand the social context of his time, and to be able to kind of talk a little bit about what you just mentioned, is that the Jews always felt that when they were under pressure, that there was going to be some type of savior, somebody like King David, or even the Maccabees during the reign when the Greeks started, when Alexander the Great, went into Persia, and then he went into India, and after his death, the Greeks had a way of suppressing the Jews, and then the Romans showed up, they suppressed the Jews. And so the Jews were constantly looking for a savior that would help them get their freedoms back, okay? So when Jesus is talking about these ideas like the mustard seed and all the other kingdom of heaven parables, you have to kind of put it in context that the Jews were expecting somebody to save them from the conditions of Roman occupation. So the stories that you would normally want to hear from Jesus are the stories of Moses leaving Egypt and the plagues that were sent upon from God to the Egyptians. You would have wanted to hear something about King David and how he slew Goliath. You would have wanted to hear something about how the Maccabees were able to push the Greeks out of Jerusalem. So all of those types of historical models would have been something that Jesus should have been talking about, and he never mentions them.
Yeah.
So there are ideas here that, when you talk about the mustard seed, that's the face of it. But just think about what's not being said. And that was the other kind of side of my research, was what should be there and what's not. And that's one of them.
Yeah, and kind of to expand on that part too. I mean, do you think that was where the majority of this missing, I don't know if missing time is the best way to phrase it, but just because here's the person that is the key focal point of the Bible. I mean, this is this is Son of God, and we know so little about this pivotal figure in this book. It's like everybody, I think one of the last shows we talked about, I was like, did everybody just forget to write it down?
Well, the Gospel of Thomas starts off with, these are the words that were written down, that were recorded from Jesus's mouth. So they understood the need to keep a record. And
yeah,
let me just kind of mention this. This is a very, very important and very fascinating point. It's 40 years until the first gospel is written after Jesus died, and that is the Gospel of Mark. So Mark is the number one gospel. Everything else follows after Mark. The Gospel of Thomas, though, seems to have some connection before those 40 years, before the time of Jesus' death to the time that the first gospel was written. So we're looking at a period of time in which nothing was written down, supposedly. But when I did, what I did was I compiled all of Jesus's sayings, the ones that are the most authentic, that the Jesus Seminar has kind of deemed the most authentic of Jesus's sayings. And from those sayings, I put on paper 25 pages of his sayings, single-spaced, 25 pages. So when I was done with just that, of just collecting his sayings and putting them down in a document, and I had 25 pages worth, I realized that somebody cannot remember 25 pages worth of sayings unless they wrote them down, or Jesus repeated himself all the time. So imagine in 3 years, all Jesus did was repeat the same thing over and over and over and over again. And I would imagine he probably sounded like a broken record. So maybe he had to start, mixing things up to bring in some new ideas, which I believe that's what we see with the parables. So The parables are very kind of long-winded. They are constructed in a way to tell these, like moral stories. He also has a very, very sharp mind when it comes to the aphorisms, do to others as you'd want them to do unto you, and give to Caesar as you want to give. All of those. This is the other thing that was kind of fascinating when I really kind of started to look at just the textual part of the Bible, is that when Jesus is using the parables, those are all very teaching-like sayings. When you get into the aphorisms, those aphorisms are more of a defensive way on which how he is dealing with his population, how he's dealing with his audience and the people that are coming against him. So it seems to me that the front end of the New Testament Gospels, Jesus is using parables a lot. The Gospel of John is a little different, but the other three, the Synoptic Gospels, are not. And it's not until you get to the end of the Gospels that he's using more aphorisms. And the aphorisms are more like Tai Chi, where you're kind of defending and, blocking all your attackers. But at the beginning, he seems to be using a lot of parables. And I thought that was also kind of a fascinating insight, is that based off of the Gospels, Jesus at first was able to teach because he wasn't confronted a lot. And then as he got further into the ministry and the years went by, more and more people who were agitators or hecklers started to really kind of follow him and then wanted to confront him.
Yeah, because and
we see that. Oh, look, that's the same book I have.
Yeah, this is one of those. I got this, and I was telling everybody, it's just this is one for anybody that's got some of the things you need. Maybe even check it out, or just go check it out at the library if they carry it. But some of these ones, because I even listened to, in preparing for this, I listened to an audio version of the Gospel of Thomas, and it was one of those, so I could kind of refresh myself on it. And it's a lot of those ones. In my things, what do you think was the biggest reason why that was excluded? I mean, because as I was listening to it, I mean, there's not really a lot different than in some of the parables and stuff than some of the other main ones, Mark, Luke, John, but you have some of the other ones where, I mean, it was almost Confucius style sayings.
Yeah, I call it the Hebrew version of Zen koans.
Yeah, that's actually a perfect way to phrase it, because when you have some of these, you can, if you were to be here, you cannot be there. It's like, if you were to be there, you cannot be here. You're after a while, you're like, okay, I got to rewind this one, and it's like try to figure this out. It's like, if you were, I'm like, oh my God, it's like, can you imagine, like you said, for 3 years, somebody going like this? I think you would either master it or you'd probably go insane.
Well, I think that this is such a loaded issue, because this kind of gets into the concepts of what happens after Jesus' death. What is he teaching? Who is he teaching this to? So I actually gave a 4-part lecture series on the Gospel of Thomas. And this was the time when all of this, I hadn't written the Interviewing Jesus book yet, but I really had to dig into the Gospel of Thomas. And I asked myself, who is the one speaking? What kind of person is this? But just as important, who's the community? So I equated it. I remember when I was in junior college and I was taking calculus, and I thought, I kind of had to go back to that moment when I was learning calculus. And I went, the Gospel of Thomas is like calculus. You have to have geometry and algebra and trigonometry and all of those different ideas, or all those different subjects and all that math first before you can even get into the equations of calculus. And I realized that the Gospel of Thomas was exactly the same thing. No one who has no one is going to walk into this particular group and start listening to those sayings and have any clue as to what Jesus is talking about, or the person who's leading this group. There's just no way. So at what point do you have to learn what things you have to learn first before you can even get to the Gospel of Thomas? And Jesus's ministry is more about, if you really think about it, it's just like trying to get everybody excited about all the new concepts that Jesus is talking about, how to love your neighbor, how to deal with compassion. Look at all the miracles that I perform. And then he has some of the more deeper ideas that are sprinkled throughout the New Testament, but there's nowhere near the amount that you find in the Gospel of Thomas. So did Jesus have like two different types of audiences, or three or four, in which he had to kind of deal with, the basic kind of baby foodish kind of things, and then finally he kind of was taking a few of the disciples, and I think Thomas might have been one of them, where he's more intellectually inclined, and he just said, look, I'm going to start telling you these deeper ideas, because Thomas was able to understand them. What you see with Peter in the Gospel of Thomas and a few others is that they're just completely confused, and that confusion also shows up in the New Testament Gospels as well. They think that Jesus is going to become king of the Jews, and that they're going to probably have some position in his cabinet.
Yeah, I was going to agree with that.
That was about to happen.
Yeah, I was going to agree with you in there too, because there's I'm trying to think. It's close to the end of the Gospel of Thomas, where Thomas is pulled aside by Jesus, and they have basically a one-on-one conversation. And when he comes back, they're like, "What did I tell you? What did he tell you?" And it was like, well, if I tell you, you're you're all going to be killed.
Right.
And so
it's
that would
too much.
Yeah.
Right?
Which kind of would lead to what you're saying.
That's how I had to look at Jesus's nuts and bolts of his ministry. Everything to me was just, I've done a lot of building in my life, so I need, is this a 2x4? What is the spacing? Is it 16 inches on center? Is it 24? What kind of, do we need a 4x6, or do we need a 8x? What are these types of materials that we need, and what kind of bolts do we need, and the size of the bolts, and what's the spacing, et cetera, et cetera. And I looked at Jesus's ministry and deconstructed it in the same way, like asking myself, just like I would in construction, what are we dealing with here? What size nails? What size screws? What's the spacing, etc.? I call it the nuts and bolts of Jesus's ministry. And the more I asked those types of questions, the more insights that I got, because, again, all of the Gospels are just trying to deal with really big picture stuff, but I was more interested in imagining what Jesus's ministry was like. What would it be like if I was walking with him? What would I be hearing? What would I be seeing? Who would he be talking to? When would he be talking? What was it like to go inside, into a village, etc.? Those types of things. And those to me were very, very important. So again, maybe it was a little bit more like, what would it be like if I were to make a documentary of just following Jesus around? What would I see? What would I experience?
Yeah, we did have one question. It is about, and this kind of goes to the other thing. It's like, are you a believer in, or even entertaining the thought of that Jesus was something, not ET per se, but, just from another, because one of the questions was like, do you believe he's Palladian? Do you follow that?
I can't answer the idea that if he's Palladian, but I can tell you the Gnostics sure believed that he was God, and so did the proto-Christians. So there was some element that made Jesus stand way above everybody else in his time, and he was like a shining light. So there had to have been something that was really quite remarkable about him. The question is was he literally like from some other place, as some people think? And I'm of the opinion. Well, I think we all have, all of our souls are from other places in other dimensions, and then we enter into the human body to have a human experience. And I think that Jesus was too. I also think that there are things about Jesus that are very consistent with what you might find in the New Testament, in which that he was kind of predestined to be here. And I believe that he believed that. Now, I think I have a lot of mystical experiences. And there was one experience that I had in which there were like kind of the ascended masters of the Hebrews kind of came to me. And I thought, oh my God, there's a whole, the whole Hebrew consciousness, if you want to put it that way, that seems to be, behind this particular group of people. And Jesus was either part of that or he was outside of that and he came into it. But Jesus was Hebrew. He was Jewish through and through. and he fully engaged in and dealt with and understood his Hebrew heritage. And it goes way back. You can't take Jesus out of that community. And, you just can't, you can't extract him out of it.
There's so many questions. Mark, go ahead before I get into that.
Okay, I was just going to say, you were talking about Jesus's ministry. He would, in your book, Interviewing Jesus, the Man, you talk about he was mentored by John the Baptist, but you believe that Jesus and John had two different types of ministries. Can you tell us a little bit about the differences between the two cousins?
Yes. First of all, they are blood relations. And two, the question would be, why would Jesus need to go to John the Baptist? And the traditional Christian point of view is that for him to be filled with the Holy Spirit. And philosophically, that doesn't make any sense to me. If Jesus is God, God can't fill himself with God to become more God, nor can God become less God and nor can he kind of empty himself and become less God. So God can't become more and God can't become less than himself. So if Jesus is being infused with the Holy Spirit, that makes no sense to me, because if he's God, how can he be filled with himself? So there's that aspect of it. It's, a funny little conundrum if you'd like to kind of like work through that one. However, when it comes to Jesus, I had to ask myself, what does Jesus bring to the table and what does he learn on the job? And, we all know what it's like to have to, go out and do work and learn things on the job. So there's that element to Jesus's ministry that I think there was an aspect that he had to learn things on the job. However, there are things that he brought to the table before he went to John the Baptist. And I had to ask myself, what would Jesus be bringing to John the Baptist, or what would he be bringing to the Jordan River that he already had, and what did he have after the Jordan River experience? And so I am totally convinced that Jesus, before he went to John the Baptist, had a complete understanding of who the Father was before that experience with John. So that he didn't have to learn that on the job. So the question now becomes, what other kind of things would Jesus have brought to the table? And then what did he learn on the job? And I think Jesus he went to John for a variety of reasons, one of which was probably go through the baptism ceremony. Two was just to kind of go through a bit of an initiation. And three was the way that he started his ministry. But I also think he went to John because John was already engaged in a ministry and he wanted to know more of the nuts and bolts of how to do things. And John probably had like a fire in his belly and he had a fire in his eyes. And, maybe Jesus had, maybe a minor bit of, what do I need to do here? Maybe I don't have the skills, or maybe I can learn how to, have the skills to do this. To me, it was a very fascinating kind of subject. The other thing is that right after John, apparently in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus goes out into the desert for 40 days. In the Gospel of John, Jesus goes down to Jerusalem. So it's two conflicting stories.
Yeah, and it was kind of some of those ones like before my question I was going to ask you, because here's one of the things that for me has just always been like his parents. Why do they just suddenly stop talking about him?
Exactly.
I just want to think. Here's a Virgin Mary. I mean, the quintessential, figure in Catholic Church. You have the virgin birth, and then you basically from there until the crucifixion, nothing.
Yeah, very little, very little. The other thing that you don't hear about is his father, Joseph. Mm-hmm. And you don't hear about any of the other family members. You do hear there's a couple of instances where Jesus's family showed up when he was healing somebody, and his family had to take him out, and they said, he is crazy. So there is that. However, in the book of Luke, Mary is mentioned as one of the women of means who traveled with Jesus. So if there's any ideas and concepts that Jesus was a poor man, this that quote in itself nullifies that, and it kind of obliterates that concept that Jesus was poor. He wasn't. He came from a very wealthy family.
And that's where I can't remember who I was listening to this. Yeah, you know, apologize. It might have even been one of your interviews where they talked about where it gave proof that there's a good chance that, you know, going to the story of Bethlehem and everything, they were fleeing persecution.
That's correct. So
and that's
Brian,
why.
yeah, there's a couple of interesting issues when it comes to the New Testament and Jesus's birth. So there's a lot of mystery around it. The first thing is that it mentions that Herod the Great, at the time of Herod the Great. So if I take that at face value, Herod the Great died in the year 4 BC. And then it says that the first Roman governor, Coponius, I think his name is, he doesn't show up until 6 AD. So there's a 10-year gap between the death of Herod and the beginning of the Roman occupation, with the governor. So before the kings of Israel at that time, before that moment, they were given their status and their power through the Romans, and so they were working with the Romans through the Romans. But Herod, unfortunately, was so paranoid that he actually killed his children. He had 10 wives, and he killed his wife, the one that he loved the most, and he killed his most competent sons, and he killed his wife's brother. So this man was, he felt that his kingdom was threatened at all times. He felt that he was, as he was getting older, that, you know, his power was waning. And so he was killing off anybody that was a threat to him. And so when he finally died, it was his incompetent son that took over. And so the Romans realized that this guy was incompetent, so they brought in their own leader, their own governor. And that was in around 6 BC or 6 AD. At that time, there was a man by the name of Judas the Galilean who was also a Pharisee. And he was living out this idea that Roman occupation was a horrible thing. Anybody who acquiesced to Roman law was not worthy to live. And so he felt that if you're not going to you are not going to act as a slave and then try to be free. Because if you believe in God the way that I believe in God, then you are a free person. And because you're willing to give up your freedom to become a slave, you therefore relinquish and sacrifice your life. And he went out as an avenging angel and started slaughtering all these Jews up in the Galilee. At the time of Jesus's birth, roughly right around that time. So Jesus most likely was from a city called Sepphoris, and that was one of those cities that Herod the Great was making into kind of a Roman model city, and it was on the rise. So, you know, there was a lot of good things that Herod did. He was a great builder, and he's a great kind of visionary when it came to that. And the economy was booming because of all of the construction that he was engaged in. But after he died, then all that kind of came to a collapse. So therefore, the economy also went through a collapse. And that was when the Romans were really kind of saying, look, it's time to start paying more of your taxes. And then the temple priests and their guards went after people to say, you need to start paying your temple tax. So what we see from Jesus's birth is that his mom and dad were leaving one area to go to another for the census. Well, that was essentially being marked and then being told that you owe them taxes. And then after that, we find that he left and went to Egypt right afterwards. So something's fishy.
Yeah. No, while you're describing that, I just realized a missed opportunity. I have the Life of Brian, the People's Front of Judea shirt. And so as you're saying, I'm like, oh, I should have worn that t-shirt. Why? Oh, such failures. Anyway, yeah, it's just because right, you said the thing.
That's a very funny movie.
Oh, God, that would have been perfect. Well, it's
very insightful, very funny movie.
Well, it's, you know, when we talk about religion, I mean, I bring this quote up quite often, but if there is not the best microcosm for how religion is the everybody going, this group splits to follow the shoe, this group splits to follow the gourd, and you have the one guy that's like, let's just stop, let's just pray. And then he looks around, he's the only one sitting here there praying and meditating, and you just kind of like, and then just wanders off. Oh God, that movie's
They were
the best.
so insightful. They were so insightful.
Oh yeah, but yeah. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay. Yeah.
So, Mark, does that answer the question about John the Baptist?
I think I would say so.
How do you like that?
What you said, or Craig's segue into Wome and throw him to the floor?
Oh yes.
Oh,
yep.
That's what you're thinking about.
Yeah, you answer my question, but you know, with the revolt, Judas the Galilean's revolt that you were just talking about, and you know, the more well-known finding refuge in Egypt. Those are historical facts, but you're also looking at how Jesus's family, and you did mention Mary a little bit ago, and what did you learn about the family's interactions with each other? What's your evidence as you recreate their family?
Yeah, I think that there's a very interesting family dynamic there. Of course, everything that I'm saying is I'm just trying to understand some of the things that are in the New Testament, and then extrapolate deeper, into it, because I understand some issues of personality and personality behaviors. Before I do that, I do want to mention this is one of the things that's very, very important when I get into the nuts and bolts. If Judas the Galilean was in Galilee and he's going around slaughtering all these people, and he went from village to village and he did all this stuff, imagine what Jesus and his disciples must have confronted when he went to the exact same places. So here it was, roughly 30 years before, Jesus would go into a village, and that village was like decimated. So there was a lot of people that remembered what Judas the Galilean did. And one of the things that Jesus does is he says, I come in peace. So you have to ask yourself, what's he talking about here? And I think it has a lot to do with the suspiciousness and the animosity of what happened when somebody else who was supposed to have been, a Pharisee or a priest or a teacher with a group of people walking into a village. Is this guy going to kill us, or he's supposed to be teaching us? So there was that ambiguity that he must have confronted at all times. In fact, one of the cities or one of the villages or towns that Judas wiped out was Emmaus. And that's the exact same road Jesus was on after his resurrection, when he met with the two men who didn't understand who he was until he broke bread in their house. And it was on the road to Emmaus that happened. Well, Judas the Galilean kind of wiped that whole village out. At least that's what I believe. Okay, so when it comes to Jesus's family, we have several things that are going on here. First of all, Jesus is not the only child. He has a brother James, he has a brother Joseph, he has a brother Judas, and he has a brother Simon. And based off of the way in which all the texts are written at this particular point, Jesus always is the first one mentioned. And that seems to be very consistent with the way in which the Jews would deal with their chronology of siblings. So Jesus was probably most likely, he was the firstborn son. He is having his first bar mitzvah at 12. And probably the second oldest brother is James. And as you know, Craig, from the Gospel of Thomas, it's James is mentioned as James the Just, and you need to go to him. All right. And he ended up becoming the first kind of the bishop of Jerusalem, right? He was the leader of the Jerusalem church after Jesus' death. So he is also mentioned as one of the brothers, or most likely one of the brothers that came when Jesus was going through one of his miracle and healing sessions, that they dragged him out of the house. His brothers dragged him out of the house and said that he was crazy. So the question now becomes whether or not James is the same James who wrote the book of James. It's in the New Testament, and James, Jesus' brother. This makes, a very, very fascinating subject, because what we see in Jesus is somebody who's extraordinarily intelligent. He is really an amazing storyteller. He knows words really, really well. He has kind of a conviction about him, and probably a charisma about him that was very, he probably had that all his life. It's very possible that when we read that, Mary was, an angel came to Mary and said, "You're going to have the son," and that there was a very strong sense that both Mary and her husband Joseph, who, by the way, was married, was probably married earlier and already had children, and so Jesus was a stepbrother to probably a number of other people. So Mary probably doted on Jesus, like thinking that he was something very special. So the question now becomes whether or not Jesus was kind of like what happened to Joseph with the multicolored coat back in the Old Testament, when his when all of the brothers threw him under the bus and sold him into slavery. Did Jesus's brothers feel the same way about Jesus, that somehow he was deemed as the special one, he got special treatment? Or was he a little bit more, I'm thinking, because he walked around and did what he did, that Jesus probably had a very strong personality, and he was probably a little bit of a rebel, and was probably confronting people as a child, and probably got in people's face or made fun of them, or, corrected them. And so anyway, you kind of start having to think about what that was, what that kind of dynamic was. But we also know that Jesus's father was a very righteous man. So he really believed in the kind of the law, the Jewish traditions. And so he was very observant. So I think that was very, very important. So Jesus had that whole kind of structured religious upbringing, as well as a whole lot of other people. And then I think when it came to James, James was more like the kind of the law. He was like the lawman, and Jesus was more like kind of a, I would call him, hopefully this isn't a bad way of describing him, but he was more like a hippie in a sense. He really was this guy that started to really think outside of the cliche, that he was thinking outside of the box. And so how did he kind of ruffle his brothers and sisters' feathers? The other thing that would happen is that I also know that Jesus came from a fairly wealthy family. They were probably merchants of some sort, or they owned some type of estate that grew cash crops, whether it would be, oil or grapes or apples, I'm not really sure what, but something of a cash crop kind of a nature. When it came to inheritance, Jesus should have been, when his father died, he should have taken over the family business, and he doesn't. Mm-hmm. James does. So is there animosity with James and Jesus that would make that was there any of that animosity in which James now feels like he has to take over the family business, and maybe he wasn't ready for it? Maybe he didn't feel like he was capable of doing it. Maybe he didn't want to do it. Maybe he felt like he had his own life. I don't know. Jesus kind of just decided to go out on his own. And we see that he went out on his own when he started his ministry. The question is did he go out on his own earlier? And my feeling is, yes, he did. This was not a pattern, or this was not the first of the pattern. He did that consistently.
Yeah, I've always kind of, one of my favorite comedians, Jim Gaffigan, he's always had his routine about Jesus, as a carpenter. And it's, one of the things is like, hey, Jesus is, out there, and it's just he's like, I'm the son of God. Right now, you're building the shed. Now hop to it.
Exactly.
And I've always looked at those things. It's like so little is spoke about this thing. I mean, was it just? I mean, when you think about it, like as siblings and stuff, okay, you're the son of God. You could perform these miracles. Either this was something he learned later on, or was it the type of thing where if something broke, all you just go, and it's back together, and you're like, did you break the jar? No.
This isn't.
You can see right there. It's there.
Well, you raised the Gnostic Bible up, and so one of the things that I did is I just collected as many anthologies as I could based off of this particular period. 100 years before, 100 years after Jesus's birth and death, and there is one group of stories that talk about Jesus, the infant Jesus, and what he did. And so there's one instance where he actually killed, a little boy because he was so angry with them. So all the parents, kind of gathered around and said, "Hey, how bad you are." And he just says, "Look, let me just show you what I can do." And he just raises the kid, from the dead. So I can tell you based off of that story that those people at that time were thinking about what Jesus's life was before he started his ministry. So, now they had to kind of invent, some stories, and him going kind of rogue in a, funny way. And he had to learn how to not be so rogue with his powers. I think that's a funny way of thinking about it.
Yeah, April, some of the comments, have been doing, she just mentioned right here, it's, raising the dead, that's necromancy, modern day, you're dealing with it. So you have one of these things, it's all right there. These, basically these arts that are considered nowadays forbidden, through Christianity. And you look in the Bible and it says right there, he was practicing them all. Just everything from follow a star, astrology. I mean, it's all right. It's all in this book, and we kind of go to it. And I'm just the same way. It's like, I want to know. And you kind of in your book, interviewing with him, you're attempting to fill in some of these gaps, because that's one of the things I want to know is, how does somebody go here where you have these abilities, you can do these things? How do you not go just omnipotent? Where you're just just uncare, because you could dominate everything. I mean, if you can turn, and so how do you fight that natural urge, to go?
The natural instinct is to take your power and to wield it, right?
Yep.
And so Jesus did that, but he did it with an enormous amount of wisdom, because he realized that wisdom is what is going to be the guiding light of his ministry. So he was there to help people. He was there to show people, one, that there is this power. Two, the Father is a real, entity. It's a real reality, and he is intimately connected to it. And these are the things that you can do as well. So, but it's not for personal gain.
I mean, it's that joke,
this is a very, very important. This is a really important point. Authority requires an enormous amount of wisdom, and you don't want to be, having some childlike person having this amount of power, wielding this power without it going completely haywire. And we see that. That is something that we all grew up and we kind of have seen.
Yeah, Karen, we've been talking about the Gnostic Gospels, and when you're in Amy Allen here, just the further out over time, why has the now Catholic Church made the decisions of what is now the Word? That's a good question.
Do you think that you can explain that a little bit more? Like, what is now the Word?
I think just like what they say is that, kind of like the new doctrine, how they determined. I mean, back to everything from, I've always wondered that. Yeah, just you have the Gnostic Bible. You look at these things, they're like, why are these excluded when these clearly, why did they basically craft the word the way that they did is pretty much the best.
Well, okay, so what part of the Roman Church is becoming the custodian of this wisdom and this knowledge? Okay. And what is the story that they feel like is most important to keep this particular version of the story going, and then suppress the other parts? I mean, if you really kind of think about how the Catholic Church works. It works very, very well. They've been doing this for 2,000 years, and they either usurp any rivalry or they destroy it. So they either bring it in and they absorb it, and they modify their doctrine and their structure and their rites and their rituals to work with existing, religious concepts and rites, or they have to suppress it all. So, they've been able to do both very well.
He added here too. They didn't write the canon then on a distance from ground zero. And so I think it's just kind of like where, why the decisions, from the canon, why this was done this way. Because it seems like it was a deliberate, crafting of a narrative that they wanted.
Okay, so let's just talk about this, because this is a very fascinating idea. If you go into Jerusalem and you just start at Jerusalem and then you spread yourself out, so you go east and you go into essentially Mesopotamia and, present day Persia or Iran and Iraq, which it seems though John the Baptist was able to go towards the Euphrates River. So there's that eastern migration. If you go south from Jerusalem, you're now in Egypt. And if you go north, you're going to go into Turkey or, present day Syria and then Turkey. And then as you start to swing westward, you're going to go into Greece and you're going to go into Rome. What's interesting is that when you look at the old Christian migration, you're going to start seeing some very fascinating patterns. And one of those patterns is the closer Christianity gets towards Rome, the more Roman it looks. The further away you get, it goes into something else. And when you get down into Egypt, it gets into some very kind of spiritual, mystical ways of thinking. The Eastern Orthodox Church is a church that believes in experience. They want you to have mystical experiences. The Catholic Church just did not want to do that. They wanted to go with the law and order and writing and scripture and the rites and rituals. This is it. This is the box. This is how it's all going to look and how it's going to work. And so they just kept to that. It wasn't until you get further into like the medieval time that the mystical experiences of like St. John of the Cross, and St. Teresa of Avila and those people, that it gets more mystical. Then there's a whole mystical tradition that, grows up out of that. The one before that was Pseudo Dionysius. And, Chris, or Craig, if you're interested in any of this, you should read some of Dionysius's his writing.
Yep, that's
he really gets into the mystical names of God. You might be interested in that.
Yeah,
there's a whole. This is what kind of like. Well, let me just mention this.
No.
There are two sides to Christianity. There is this Roman version, and then there's this mystical version, and the Gnostics being one of them. They were all Christians. They all saw themselves as Christians. It's just that one seemed to be more, bent on morality and literature than the other side was. So, my feeling is that it would be great if you can kind of bring these back together and show the truth in both of them. So it's almost like a man and a wife that are married, and now they're separated. And so there seems to be a need within the kind of the Western version of Christianity to bring back some of those lost traditions so that it can kind of go through its own healing. That's my take on it. And this literature is part of that.
And David, since we've just been touching on the profiling that you've done in this book, based on the parables, recreating history based on what we know. All that had an impact on Jesus at up to he was like 12 or so, but one of the philosophies that was around that you get into in your book was the Essenes, what impact did they have, their philosophy have on the young Jesus?
I think quite a bit. So
Okay.
it's believed that John the Baptist was an Essene priest, and it seems almost impossible for Jesus not to have had direct contact with the Essenes. And this is rather interesting. I'm the type of person that looks for pattern and what I can understand with pattern. So when I was going through Jesus's sayings, I was asking myself, what's the influence here? What is he drawing on? And so there's several different places that Jesus is drawing from. One, Jesus is Hebrew, so he's completely engaged with the Hebrew traditions. He knows that. In fact, he's either for or against it. He seems to modify some ideas of what you can do on the Sabbath and what you can't. Everybody seems to say you need to fast, and he went 40 days in the desert fasting, and yet when he's confronted, how come your disciples are not fasting? He's like, why do they need to do that? So he seems to he's embracing his Hebrew heritage. There is a very strong Essene influence here, and I'll circle back to this. Going to start looking at Jesus's influence in Greek metaphysics. We're going to start seeing Jesus's influence in the Greek rhetorical style. We're going to start seeing a very strong influence of Egyptian religious thinking. And then we're going to start getting into the Eastern philosophies. So there is a Hindu thread to Jesus's inspirations. There's a Buddhist thread. There's a Taoist thread. And there's a Confucian thread. So here are a Greek, Hebrew, Essene, Egyptian, and the four Eastern influences. They're all in Jesus, all of it. So the question is where was he? What was he doing? And how did all of this come about? And with all of that influence, you can't just say, well, there must have been some school over there that he went to. I mean, if there was so much information that his ministry and his kind of spiritual content have, it seems to me that he had to have spent time most likely in India. He had to spend time in the East. When it came to the Essenes, he spent time with the Essenes. When I looked at the way in which he was using the structure of his language and his aphorisms and the nature of the Father that he talks about, because that's Pythagorean, he had to have been exposed to Greek philosophy and Greek rhetoric, and then there was also an Egyptian element to some of his stories. So, where did all this come from? Is Jesus a composite figure, or did he actually go and experience all this stuff? My feeling is that Jesus is a very authentic person, and he's drawing from all kinds of traditions to speak the new way, the new understanding of his understanding of the divine. That's kind of a funny way of saying that. But anyway, Jesus had a very strong sense of the divine that was different than what his Hebrew heritage understood. And he was bringing that new idea into the world. And he did it as best as he could. So there's that. Now, let's just go back to the Essenes. So when I looked at, Jesus's story, I then had to read some of Josephus's, who was also a Pharisee, and he happened to be part of the group of Pharisees that rebelled against the Roman Empire in the year 66 that initiated the whole war, the Jewish war. So he was part of that. He kicked that off. Again, he's a Galilean. So we have four big Galilean people. We have Judas the Galilean, we have Jesus, we have John the Baptist, and we have Josephus. All came from the Galilee, all were working in the Galilee with all very different ideas about how things were. And to make it all the weirder, Josephus, who ended up writing the history of the Jewish first century, said to Vespasian, who was the commanding Roman general, that came in with his army from Syria, he said, oh, by the way, there's a prophecy about you that you are going to be the one who's going to save save the Jews. So here's a Pharisee saying that Vespasian, who ended up becoming the emperor, is the actual Messiah. Isn't that bizarre? To me, that's bizarre.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to the Essenes. When I looked at Jesus and what he did, what he wore, what he said, how he said it, what, how he thought of the nature of community. When I was reading Josephus, I went, oh, there's an idea that's same as Jesus. There's an idea, there's an idea, there's an idea, and now all of a sudden there was a list of Essene ideas that Josephus puts and writes down in his books, the history, Jewish history or Jewish wars, I can't remember which one. And all that whole list, like half of it or more, was what Jesus was engaged in. And then I started to ask myself, well, where's the rupture? Where did it go? Why did Jesus, with this whole different idea, start talking about something very different? So was he trying to carry on the Essene traditions, or was he moving outside of the Essenes because for some reason he felt that that community can no longer sustain his understanding of the divine, and that there was a rupture and he left? But there is a strong connection with the Essenes. There is a similarity that you see in Jesus's ministry with the Essenes, but there is a rupture. There is a going separate ways. And one of the separations is that Jesus felt it was more important to be on the road, which is also very different than John the Baptist. John the Baptist just was conducting his ministry at the Jordan. And Jesus seemed to want to go, just like Judas the Galilean, from town to town and village to village and city to city. And the Essenes weren't doing that. They had their own community out there by the Dead Sea Scrolls. They had their own scriptorium, and they were writing their own versions of how God is going to be showing up and how he's going to be judging the rest of the world and the rest of the Jews. So it's a very fascinating subject. The Dead Sea Scrolls is a very, very fascinating subject in and of itself. It's like a cloistered community with its own literature. And of course, they were copying all the Old Testament with the exception of the book of Esther, which is a rather interesting thing that they wouldn't copy.
Yeah, unless I misunderstood it. Yeah, M.A. Allen, he was mentioning it too. It's one of those, I think I get kind of what his question is. It's like how to, as these new discoveries are coming in, the new fragments that they find, the new scrolls that they find, how are they fitting this into the doctrine? Just is it one of those that they just keep like, put that in the basement of the Vatican? We're not gonna talk about that right now.
Well, the Essenes in the Dead Sea community, Dead Sea Scroll community, had a great deal of influence on the early Christian movement. There's quite a bit there. One of the things that I found is that when we kind of go back to Jesus's family and why wasn't there more information about them told in the Gospels? What I found by doing the reading in the Dead Sea Scrolls is that the people inside the community had I don't want to disparage them in any way, but there was a very cult-like thinking in their terms. They were the only ones that were right. Everybody else was wrong. They were the legitimate tribe of Israel. They were the legitimate sons of Aaron, sons of Zadok, who should have been the priests in the temple, and they should have been doing the rites in the temple. And so they felt that they were living their life according to the way God wanted them to live, so that they would then become they would inherit all of the power in Jerusalem when everything got cleared out, when the Messiah showed up, and when the Romans were thrown out, and when the corrupt high priests were thrown out. The high priest had a racket going. So just think about this. At think all the meat that was used as sacrifice. So there was a great meat market. There was an oil market. There was a spice market. These people were making a lot of money off of this, and that's why Jesus was kind of doing what he was saying with the money changers here, and they were making money off of the exchange. I mean, everything about it was it was industrialized, and then
Cassidy
also
brought up. Oh no, go ahead. Sorry.
Say that again.
No, I said go ahead. Just finish your thought. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut
Oh.
you off there.
So anyway, so the Essenes felt that they were the ones that were legitimate everywhere, and that the big war between good and evil was about to happen. We're going to pick up those ideas that you have a community, you break bread, we are the true community. This is the Christians, right? At the end, somewhere along the way, Jesus, the Messiah, is going to return. He's going to restore the ownership to the rightful people that are supposed to be in charge, etc. And there's going to be a big judgment day. So, of course, that's also Egyptian as well. The Judgment Day is Egyptian. Anyway, it's a very fascinating, idea. Now, whether the ideas themselves might not necessarily have gotten into the scriptures, but the certain concepts sure did, about community, about bread, about the belief that they were, kind of elected, and there's a battle between good and evil, etc. Those are the types of things that come in.
Yeah, David.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Mark.
Interviewing Jesus is really a fascinating read. But when you look at your international travels, how did all of your experiences impact you? It's like if you put yourself in the 13-year-old Jesus setting out to walk to India, you're kind of doing the same type of journey. How did you change by being in the same area where all these events took place?
I have not been able to get to the Holy Lands, but I have been to Turkey, and I've been from Istanbul all the way to Lake Van and to the east of Turkey, and then to the south. And I was able to go through what used to be Paul Tarsus. I went through there as well. Part of my experience of traveling there's an intimacy in traveling, and when I was asking myself, did Jesus travel? Did Jesus learn how to travel with his ministry while he ministered, or was Jesus adept at traveling before he got started? And I think Jesus definitely had a very strong background in which traveling was part of it. And he was very comfortable, involved with moving from one place to another. So the fact that I have done as much traveling as I've done, it made me believe that Jesus too went through his own travels. But I think I did some traveling that was very specific. And then I also did a lot of traveling because I wanted to go to certain museums and I wanted to go to certain battlefields and things like that. So it was for more of my benefit and more of my pleasure to go to those places. But I think when it came to Jesus and his traveling, I think there was more of a mission involved. He seemed to be guided and directed. And specifically, my feeling is that he did go to India just because of the amount of information that is in his sayings that are also Eastern, that he couldn't have gotten that without either a teacher or being immersed in it. And if he was immersed in it, then the way that they traveled, just so you know, I have been to Mount Ararat, and Mount Ararat is there's two volcanoes there, and there's a valley. And when I was there at that valley, I knew, that an earlier lifetime, I was on the Silk Road, because the Silk Road came through there. Jesus wouldn't have walked to India because the Silk Road at that time wasn't open. It didn't open until around 130, 140, 50, something like that. So the most logical route for Jesus to get to India was to travel down to the Red Sea, get a boat, travel through the Red Sea, out of the Red Sea to Yemen, probably to the west coast of Yemen or to the tip of Yemen, and then catch a boat during the trade winds to the west coast of India. And then the return trip, there would be, the trade winds would have been just the reverse. They would have been blowing towards Yemen. And so when he came back, he probably had to wait until those trade winds.
Now, Chastity had a question from earlier, and it kind of fits in right now, especially the journey. What do you think about the possibility that that would be the time, the rumored marriage to Mary Magdalene and children?
Yeah, so this is a very fascinating subject. When I was doing the Gospel of Thomas, I kept asking myself, if I were to put on my profiler hat, my FBI profiler hat, and I was trying to, understand the person who is behind the Gospel of Thomas, I put together a personality list. And then, of course, I put the personality list to the audience as well. When it came to Mary Magdalene, I asked myself something very similar, and that is, Jesus is a very strong individual. He's very smart. He seems to overcome his body. So if you think about, I call this feats of endurance. So there are three things that I noticed that were feats of endurance. One was that he went out into the desert and he fasted for 40 days. I've never done the fast for 40 days. I've done it for 4 or 5 days. I know how difficult that is. 40 days, I can't imagine, right? I mean, that's just really quite remarkable. Anybody that can do that, in my mind, is just, has been able to master the body. The grueling nature of the ministry, both on an emotional level, on an intellectual level, on a physical level, from walking, 15 miles a day, 20 miles a day, stopping, going to another one, confronting the people that you don't know how you're going to be treated. And all that's associated with that, dealing with his disciples who literally can't figure out what he's saying. And a lot of times they were constantly confronting him, saying, you can't do that, you shouldn't do that, you can't do this, you can't do that. Why are you doing this? Who sinned? You kind of go down the list, and then we don't understand what you're saying. What does all this mean? I mean, if you kind of just think about all the people that Jesus was associated with and the emotional toll it had to have taken, I just go, okay, that's another feat of a physical feat that you had to endure. And then you finally have the beating and the crucifixion. So that's another feat of endurance. So Jesus understood how to deal with the body in ways that we don't, and so that maybe meant that he had to study martial arts. Again, you have to just kind of break all this down and just go, how do you do this? No one can just say, oh, I think I'll just try this and then succeed. Where Jesus succeeds, I would fail. So there's that aspect too. Now when it came to Mary Magdalene, the issue is Jesus, when Jesus speaks about money the most of all his sayings, all of them, Jesus speaks about money the most. The number three things that he talks most about is the kingdom of heaven. So he has 22 sayings about the kingdom of heaven, and there are 9 different subjects that he talks about that are part of the kingdom of heaven. Mary Magdalene is a very fascinating person, because when Jesus is talking about money, he is talking about a merchant, the merchant mentality. He's talking about the kind of the cash crop, the plantation type of mentality. He's talking about working with his hands, and he's also talking about inheritance. Mary Magdalene was one of the women of means that is mentioned in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, who was one of his supporters. So she's a woman of means. So what does that tell us about women of means? Jesus seemed to have some attraction with women of means. There was 2 other women, Susanna and Joanna, and Joanna, who was also this woman of means, her husband, believe it or not, was the estate manager for Herod, King Herod. One of his disciples' husband was directly in the court of Herod the Great, or King Herod. Isn't that remarkable? So anyway,
Yeah.
when it comes to Mary Magdalene, it seems to me that this woman would mirror Jesus in a particular way. I would imagine she was very tough. In fact, in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus is talking to her about some of the more deeper and mysterious hidden wisdom, and she seems to get it. And there is a jealousy that is now showing up in the Gospel of Thomas that the men are angry that Jesus is telling her all these deep insights that they themselves are not getting. And then there's the Gospel of Mary, which is most likely, something that was written hundreds of years after Jesus' death. But in there, Jesus is supposed to have kissed Mary on the lips. We don't know what the word is, because that word was that section of the script was torn out or worn out. But in all likelihood, Jesus was married. When you're 30 years old, you needed to be married. That was part of the custom. I can't imagine him not. And Mary Magdalene would probably be the type of person that matched his personality very, very well, and that she was a very strong-willed individual. And she was very adept in business sense as well. And it's possible because Magdalene is kind of a name given to her, and there is a town called Magdala, which is possibly where she came from. And what Magdala was known for was its salted fish, and salted fish is the equivalent of our version of a pizza. So it was so widespread that whoever was involved with salted fish was just making a fortune. And it's possible that Jesus knew Mary because her family and Jesus's family were wealthy, and that they might have had an early connection, and he might have known her from a very early age and finally got married to her.
Yeah. Wow.
It makes it all the more interesting of when they were living together, why Jesus would have to go find his house on Capernaum. Maybe, what he was doing and what she was doing upset the community that they were in so much that he had to flee that area as well and buy this house. In the book of Mark, it says that he bought a house in Capernaum. So they had a place to go to on the north side of the Galilee. Fascinating, isn't it?
Oh, it is. And as we're wrapping it up here, I want to plug here too. It's like you got to go to davidcollis.com, website for this fantastic gentleman here who's been entertaining us this last hour. And Interviewing Jesus the Man, is the book we've been talking about. Mark's got a copy there. It's just he's been showing it from time to time. You have Barnes & Noble, Amazon.com. Go there. Now, obviously, with COVID, you don't have too many upcoming events going on. I mean, you have a couple online stuff coming on, interviews.
I'm going to be, in my book, I have 12 what I call mystery symbols. I'm rebranding those, and I'm starting to develop that. I have been, for the last 30 years or more, I have been shown, and I have all these images, and I have, being an artist, I have been drawing these things for quite some time, and I have I have 400 or 500 or 600 of them. And some of them have been coming to me, and they, they come in spurts where there's a lot at one time, and then there's a break, and then there's a lot, and then there's, it's a trickle down. So anyway, I have all these symbols, and so I'm going to start spending some time working on developing that and the teachings that are associated with that.
Awesome. Well, everybody check that. Yeah, check that out too. And David, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show.
Yeah, well, Craig, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this has been fantastic. I won't lie. When we got into this, I didn't think I was going to be going down the esoteric Gnostic Bible, Bible highway as much as we have. As I said, I've loved it. As you can see, I have the tome behind me. That's I'm into this. So like I said, this is fantastic. And so everybody,
Craig, you're going to want to get a copy of the Nag Hammadi library.
I think so. I think so.
Yeah, the Nag Hammadi.
Yeah,
as well.
I'm gonna look. Yeah, let me write that down.
And you want to get the Apocrypha, those books that are not necessarily in the Old Testament, but they're still there. So those are the three big books that I have that were very, very valuable. And there was others too, and other anthologies, but those are very important.
Yeah, it's some light reading is what it is. Some real light reading.
Exactly. And especially the Gospel of Thomas and those Zen koans.
Oh yeah, I was telling Chris what I was told him about that Gospel of Thomas. I'm like, I'm just going to warn you. This isn't some riveting reading. This is going to be a lot of. This is just reading like. Sometimes it feels like you're reading the things out of
Nonsense.
your Chinese, your fortune cookies. I mean, it just because there's just some of those. It's like it's back and forth logic, and you're just like scratching your head. It's like I think I understand this. I don't think I'm too confused. So,
well, Craig, I had a mystical experience when I was reading the Gospel of Thomas, and I was just completely confused. Going, you know what? I might have I think there are 114 sayings, and of those, it's like, I get 3 or 4 or 5 of these sayings, but I don't get them all. Well, I had a mystical experience in which all of this information just like I got downloaded with, and then I completely understood it, and it took about 3 or 4 seconds. So it was just I had a complete opening. Yeah, and that's why I ended up giving a 4-part lecture series on the Gospel of Thomas because of it. Yeah, the information is very, very deep. It's very profound. Wow. And there's wisdom behind it. It's not just words trying to be, sound stupid. There's a lot of wisdom behind it.
You're just going to have to come back and keep talking about your research.
There is so much information from this period that is so dense and it's so exciting. And all I can say is that we're just looking at the literary point of view. We're not looking at the experiential point of view or kind of like how you live your life point of view. They were working both sides of all of this. They were dealing with the rites. They were dealing with creating new rituals. They were creating new literature. They're creating new understanding of the universe. And it's just a remarkable amount of material and insight. And it's fabulous.
How cool it would be if this man got access to the Vatican archives.
Yeah, as long as everything's translated into English. It would be fun.
Exactly. You got to get that universal translator. So, all right, well, everybody, go to Amazon.com, pick up Interviewing Jesus, the Man from David Collis, and go check him out on davidcollis.com. Sir, thank you so much. Have a great night. We will be in touch.
Hey, thank you for having me on.
Hey,
see you guys.
Our pleasure. Thank you. All right, everybody. This was another exciting episode. Man, I'm blown away. I've been writing down notes at the same time. I've been interacting with everybody. So appreciate everybody, all your questions, comments, and stuff. This was
April had some great observations.
Oh yeah, this was fantastic. So everybody, please. I know. It's one of those. You think I'm prepared? No, I'm not.
I thought I knew a little bit about the Bible, but I was like, okay.
You realize when you have guests like him, just with that have taken the time, they've done all this work, all this research. You realize, I mean, you can tell when somebody has a passion for something because it flows. I mean, it's just like without a breath. I mean, he was just rattling off. I mean, I couldn't write notes fast enough. I'm sitting here looking up stuff as he's talking. I'm sitting here searching up things. I'm like, I don't think I know about that. I was searching up. So it was fantastic. But Mark, thank you so much for coming on again, helping us out, keeping us grounded, keeping us from getting too crazy as usual.
I had a lot of fun.
All right. Yeah. So once again, but everybody, please go pick up that book, support him. Thanks for everybody that was watching and, all the questions, comments. It was fantastic. So everybody, appreciate it. Have a great night. We will see you later next week with some more fantastic shows. Good night. Maybe, if I know what to press. Hey, am I working?